I'm Rick Dadarian, and you're listening to Realms of Memory. In October 1967, Nigerian federal troops slaughtered hundreds of innocent civilians in the town of Asaba. Once a thriving center of education, famed for producing doctors, lawyers, teachers, and high-ranking civil servants, the Asaba massacre shattered the community for generations. Yet over 50 years later, those responsible for the massacre have never been held accountable. The Nigerian government has never issued an official apology or paid reparations to the victims and their families. Elizabeth Bird, anthropologist and professor emerita at the University of South Florida, argues that the Asaba massacre wasn't just one of the many atrocities committed during the Nigerian Civil War. It was a pivotal event that prolonged a conflict that claimed over 1 million lives. What were the causes of the Asaba massacre? How did it prolong the war? How did it affect the lives of the people of Asaba? And how has it been remembered? To answer these questions, I'm very pleased to welcome Liz Bird, co-author with Fraser Otonelli of The Asaba Massacre, Trauma, Memory, and the Nigerian Civil War. Liz, thank you for joining this episode of Realms of Memory.
You're very welcome, and it's a pleasure to be here.
So the subject of your book, The Asaba Massacre, takes place within the context of the Nigerian Civil War. And the massacre, in many respects, is a consequence of the ethnic divisions that ripped apart this newly formed nation and former British colony. So how far back do these ethnic divisions go? And to what extent were they intensified by British rule? And how did this particular Igbo population become especially targeted?
Well, that is a very long and complicated question. And yes, it goes back really long before the British colonized. Before Britain or any other European power came on the scene, there was no Nigeria. There were various ethnic groups, various kingdoms, various little enclaves all across this area. British showed up. Well, they've coming into the area that is now Nigeria since probably 17th century. Certainly the Portuguese had been there trading and so on, very involved in the slave trade, obviously. But at that point, that you're dealing with one kingdom or one group at a time. There's no united Nigeria, and so the Britain really consolidated its situation in the 19th, early 20th century. Created something called the Southern Protectorate. And then later the Northern Protectorate, which was the northern part of Nigeria and the southern part of Nigeria. Eventually, I can give you a lot more detail than that, but that's probably the main thing. And then it united these two areas, forcibly really, in 1914 and created Nigeria. But the northern part of the country really had very little in common at all with the South. The North was Muslim, had been since probably from anywhere from the 12th to 13th century, had really become Muslim, and it connected really for trade, for culture, for everything with North Africa, the Middle East, and so on. It wasn't very connected with the South. The South was there are approximately 250 ethnic groups in Nigeria. So it isn't a question of just the Igbo, Hausa and Fulani are the main groups in the north. In the south, you have the Yoruba and the Igbo are the two other really large groups. But there's literally hundreds of other groups as well. But a lot happened with the colonization. But when Britain took over and tried to kind of push all of these areas together, they ruled them very differently. In the north, they used what they called indirect rule, which was a system where they kind of co-opted the local leaders, imams and sultans and other leaders, and ruled through them. They didn't disrupt. They didn't change the the system, really. They allowed it to operate as it always had been, but they were now in charge. They didn't introduce education, religion, mission. They didn't want to upset the local leaders by trying to bring in Christianity or anything. So things pretty much kind of were stable, but very favored by the British. In the South, it was a whole different kind of structure. The Igbo, for instance, were a very dispersed group. They didn't have chiefs, leaders, kings. They had small village groupings, a much more democratic kind of system of governance. Male dominated, certainly, but generally much more a flat kind of governance structure. There was where the Royal Niger Company, which was licensed by the British, came in with trading, all kinds of trade. They took over the whole Niger River basin, really, and introduced, and following the trade, you had missionaries. Missionaries created schools. It was a very different dynamic happening there. The Igbo essentially embraced Western styles of religion, of education. They became very involved in commerce and business. In around the 1950s to 60s, vast majority of university graduates were Igbo students. Many Igbo went abroad for education. In the North, the levels of education were really quite low, and it's, I say, a very, very different dynamic. So, kind of long story short, but before independence came in 1960, but before that, what the British were trying to do was set up. They were calling indigenizing all the civil service and commerce and so on. So they recruited a lot of local people to take these positions, but there was the Igbo and the Yoruba, but mostly the Igbo who were qualified to take these positions, and they took them all around the country. So in the north, they would be running civil service, they would be running the railroad, they would be running other kinds of businesses and so on. And this created a lot of tension, a lot of resentment from the north. I'll stop there. Just you can ask more if.
I mean, you would think in terms of economic opportunity, if there's one population that is going to identify more with a Nigerian nation, it's the Igbo population.
Yes, I mean that's probably true. They didn't identify with the North, really. The separation between the Muslim North and the non-Muslim South was really very profound, and actually still is. I mean, this pushing these two very disparate populations together made things very difficult. But also, the British set up a new governmental system before independence, where there would be a federal government, and people would be representatives would be elected to the parliaments, but it was dependent on population numbers. The North had 50% of the population. Every other area combined was the other 50%. So the North really had a stranglehold on power, and that again created a lot of tension. So in the early 60s, there was a lot of disputes about censuses, because censuses became important if you're looking at populations. And then there were elections that were run poorly. There was a lot of corruption, and a lot of just riots and violence around the mid-60s. As the regions, at that point, there were 4 regions of Nigeria as defined by the way the British had set it up. So there was the northern region, the southern region, the northern region, the western region, the eastern region, and then the Midwest, which was a small region that was very multi-ethnic, kind of right there in the middle, but by the River Niger. So you had these 4 regions. They were all trying to vie to get people into government, but none of them really has the power to do that. So a lot of unrest leading up to independence and in the immediate years following independence, and a lot of resentment against the Igbo, particularly, who were seen as very they were seen as pushy. The rest of Nigerians sort of saw them as pushy people who wanted power. They would see themselves differently. They would see themselves as entrepreneurial, as having a great deal of education initiative, and so on. So you get this situation of great instability in the years from independence in 1960 through till 1966. In 1966, there was a series. There was a first of a coup. In 1966, there was a coup that happened in January of that year, and it was a coup led by a group of young army officers, mostly majors, and mostly of Igbo origin. In a way, that wasn't surprising because the Igbo again dominated the military forces. But what they said they were doing was they wanted to form a new government that would be free of the corruption and the ethnic hostilities and so on. But the coup actually turned out to be pretty violent, because what they did was they killed northern leaders. They killed the prime minister, the federal prime minister. They killed various leaders from the northern region. And of course, that just exacerbated tension and hostility towards what was seen as the Igbo. The coup was overthrown and the leaders were arrested, but it sparked a whole other set of rioting, and it began what became known as the pogroms, which were people which were in the northern and west, and mostly the northern region, people set upon the Igbo. They lived in segregated areas within the north, but they ran a lot of the business and the civil service and so on. So this tension that had been there for a long time kind of spilled over, and Igbos were just attacked, assaulted, murdered in thousands, and nothing much happened. A little later in the year, there was a second coup. After the first coup, a new leader was installed, General Aronsi, who was an army officer and also an Igbo. So obviously still not trusted. He took over, but was himself toppled in a coup several months later in 1966, and murdered. And a new group of people came in. The leader that was chosen to lead Nigeria at that point was a man called Yakubu Gowon, who was a 32-year-old military major at that point, who was from a small ethnic group and therefore was perceived as somewhat neutral. He took over. The pogroms continued, and he didn't seem to be able to do anything to control them. And essentially, Igbo in the north started just pouring back into the east. Millions of Igbo were spread around the country. The east was their territory, their homeland, but they had been living in the north and west and elsewhere in all of these other jobs. They started pouring back by roads, by rail, and back into the eastern region. It's estimated that probably about 30,000 Igbo were killed in these pogroms, and well over 1 million, probably 1 to 2 million, fled back out of those areas into the eastern region. The eastern region is to the east of the River Niger. That's essentially the boundary. Gowon had created military governors in each of the 4 regions, and the military governor in the east was called Emeka Ojukwu. He was a very young man, 34 years old, ambitious. Gradually, from the end of 1966 onwards, there were all kinds of attempts made to try and get the Igbo back into the fold, as it were. There was a big conference at Aburi in Ghana in early 1967. Everything failed, and by May, Ojukwu was saying that the Igbo were not safe in Nigeria, that they could not survive attached to the rest of the country. He was very confident that the East, dominated by Igbos, but with many other ethnic groups there as well, was the best educated, the best prepared, and actually the most Western group of Nigeria. So May 1967, Ojukwu declares secession. He says, we're going to go it alone. And I think he was hoping that would mean that essentially the Eastern region could split off peacefully and become a nation of its own. He felt confident it could be an independent nation. It had good resources. It had, as I say, a highly educated population. It had some potential. It also had a lot of oil, and that turned out to be one of the key issues. He named the new country Biafra, and it was named after the Bight of Biafra, which is a small sort of coastal area, not well known up until that point, and declared to be the sovereign state of Biafra. From May to June, not a lot happened, but in July, finally, Gowon was intent on keeping Nigeria together, and certainly the British were no longer literally the colonial masters, but they were very much involved, very much in control. They wanted to keep Nigeria as one country. They had a lot of interest in keeping it together, the resources that were available, and so forth. So Nigeria began what they called a police action at first. They were just going to hopefully their idea was go into Biafra, put down the coup, the rebellion, as they called it, not a coup, sorry, a rebellion, and bring Nigeria together again. And they did quite well to begin with. They went in through the north and into the parts of northern Biafra. They took over a lot of areas, including the university town, Suka, eventually the capital. But they didn't really consolidate things. And in August of 1967, the Biafrans decided they were, a very bold move. They were going to invade Nigeria. So essentially, that's what they did. They came over the Niger, over the bridge, the new Niger Bridge, which had only been built a couple of years before, was their route in through the big city of Onitsha on one side and into Asaba, a town which was actually on the west coast of the west side of the river, and was in the Midwestern region. And so they came across the bridge. They didn't really stop. They just kept going. Their troops fanned out. They were heading for Lagos, which was then the capital of Nigeria. Heading there, they also were fanning west and east and trying to take over various places on the way. They moved through Benin City, which was the capital of the Midwest district at the time, Midwest region, and headed out towards Lagos. They nearly got there, but they were turned back. Eventually, the federal forces, which had grown rapidly, they had to recruit literally thousands of troops, which they did, often very untrained troops. They were recruiting from prisons, from anywhere they could find people. But they did succeed in pushing the Biafrans back all the way along. They made it through about 200 to 300 miles west, but they were pushed back by the federal forces, came all the way back to the river. And then the Biafrans fled. They retreated across the river back into Biafra, and they exploded the bridge on the way. They put charges, various kinds of explosive under it, blew it up, which meant that the federal troops who were pursuing them were stuck. you couldn't really go across in ferries or anything. They needed to go to the bridge. So they stopped, and they were in Asaba, this small town, which was in an interesting situation because it was ethnically Igbo, but they used to call themselves Western Igbos. They would be not quite the same as the Eastern Igbos, but very similar. The language is basically the same. They had a lot of sympathy with Biafra. Some of them did. But on the whole, they wanted to stay part of Nigeria. So they felt that they were very safe. They hadn't been attacked by the Biafrans at all as they came through. And then the federal forces came in and occupied the city. Which brings...
That's a lot to summarize.
It is, and I'm sorry if it's too dense.
No. That was excellent. So at this point, you have a kind of a stalemate, right? These two forces that are facing each other with this river dividing the two. And you said the federal forces are camped out in Asaba. What makes this community especially vulnerable? What is it? What are its characteristics that really puts it at risk, even though it seems like the people themselves don't realize it?
Yeah, the troops mostly camped out on the outskirts. They weren't at that point really inside. They arrived. All this had happened between August and October. The Biafrans had crossed the bridge in August, pushed back, and then they had retreated back over the river in the first few days of October. So we're looking at around October 3rd, 4th, 5th, the Federals arrived. The thing about Asaba was really, as I mentioned, they were predominantly Igbo in ethnicity, and a lot of the federal troops were. And well, they were feeling very hostile towards the Igbo. One of the things that the Biafrans had done when they came through to the west was they'd occupied Benin City, which is most of the ethnicities in Benin are called Edo people, and they had actually been pretty violent themselves. They had they'd killed people. They had forcibly taken over the local government. There was a lot of anger at how the Biafrans behaved in that area. So the troops that were coming through, a lot of them had actually been recruited from that area, from around Benin City, as well as from the north and elsewhere. And they kind of had a score to settle. There was also a sense or a belief that the first coup that had set all of this off had been led by Igbo officers, and one of them was supposedly from around Asaba. He was actually from a little bit out of Asaba, but he was identified as Asaba because Asaba was called was a district. It was Asaba district as well as the town. So there was a general sense that these Igbos, these Western Igbos, had been part of the problem that had caused the war in the first place. I mean, they really hadn't. Asaba had no real tradition of being in the military. They were civilians. They had one of the highest rates of education in the country. They used to pride themselves on having the largest number of professors from anywhere in the country, and of academics, teachers. Highly educated sort of group. So they were very vulnerable in the sense that they just didn't know what was happening. They were just hoping that the federal troops. They didn't see it very likely that the government of Nigeria, troops representing the government of Nigeria, of which they were part and of which they were loyal subjects, would do anything violent. So it was a shock to them what happened when the troops started sort of milling into town and so on. And it became clear that they were not peaceful. The troops were angry and frustrated because they couldn't get across the river. They couldn't do what they came to do. And they started taking it out on civilians, just like pulling them out of their homes, shooting them, young boys and young men in particular. If they saw any who were if they were wearing boots, they would say, "You must be a Biafran soldier." So they would take them out and shoot them. There were all kinds of pretexts on which they were killing people. But it was in a scattered kind of way. But people were getting more and more afraid as this happened. There was a sense of things being out of control. They had no idea really why this was happening. But what they decided to do, they had a meeting. The elders of the town held a meeting, and they decided that the best thing to do would be to kind of meet with the commanders, the army commanders, and offer them money and other things, and just show them that they were peaceful. This had actually worked in some smaller towns, some outskirts towns where the Federals had come through and had been met and welcomed by the populace. So they did. They dressed up. They wore ceremonial white clothes, which are called aqua ocha. They carried placards saying "One Nigeria." They went through the streets shouting "One Nigeria, One Nigeria," and they marched, men, women, and children. There's a long street called Nabisi Road, which sort of goes through the center of what was old Asaba. So they marched down there, singing, dancing, chanting, with the goal of showing their good intent. This was on the October 7th. This was a day after there'd been quite a lot of killing the day before in small groups. But this was hundreds, possibly thousands of people who marched together. The streets were lined with soldiers. That's how people describe it, with guns, and sometimes as people went by, they would be randomly shot or pulled out of the crowd. So it was terrifying, as people described it. Just terrifying. They were just hoping things would get better, but it didn't look good. Eventually, they reached a kind of crossroads, and soldiers surrounded them, and they started separating the women from the men, and boys. And some of the survivors that I spoke to were young boys at the time, maybe teenagers of 14 or 15. Some of them talked about how there was debate: are you a child or are you a man? And some of them ended up leaving with the women if they were young looking enough, and some remained with the men. There were stories of how mothers tried to dress up their sons as women, putting dresses and wraps on them. But anyway, at that point, the women were all taken away. Women and children were all taken away to a nearby maternity hospital, and they were just kept there. Some of them reported they could hear, after that they heard gunfire. And what they were hearing was the men had been corralled. The soldiers, the officers spoke to them. There were reports of how the officers were saying, you are Igbo, we're going to kill you. They started taking them off in little groups of 10 and shooting them. And then, as some people reported it seems they got kind of tired of shooting people in small groups, so they had machine guns mounted on trucks and so on, and they just basically got people together and then started mowing them down with the machine guns. And they fell, and our witnesses, some of them report how they only survived because the other bodies fell on top of them. Eventually they crawled away. So the shooting went on for quite some time. It was raining. It was a terrible day. People just reported rain and blood, and it finally ended around late in the evening. The soldiers moved away, and the survivors crawled out, and eventually, when the women were released from where they were held, some women came and found their sons, their brothers, husbands, and took them away. In the days following that, mass graves were dug under direction of soldiers, and people were just thrown into them.
So you mentioned this is a chaotic scene, and there's frustration. There's a bit of maybe score settling going on. Are there other reasons to help explain how this could have happened? I mean, there were suspicions that Igbo in the area were collaborating with their Eastern cousins.
There were definitely suspicions that they were collaborators. That was the accusation all the time, was that you are a collaborator, you're a Biafran soldier. There really didn't seem any evidence that there was any collaboration going on. As I say, there was some sympathy. I mean, many people had relatives and friends on the east side of the river, but that doesn't really mean there was any active collaboration going on. There were stories that were passed that sort of appeared later about how an Igbo, somebody opened fire on the federal soldiers. Again, there doesn't seem much evidence of that. There really weren't armed people in Asaba. So it's difficult to explain exactly, because there seems to be one of the factors was how many poorly trained soldiers there were. These were soldiers who had joined the Federal Army, often with basically no training at all. We spoke to officers who had been at the scene, who reported that they had been essentially given recruits and 2 weeks training, and they had to somehow get them in shape to fight. And many had joined because they just needed a paycheck, or they felt there was some other way out. So the soldiers were very undisciplined, and the officers themselves, many of them were not very well trained or experienced either. So what you had was several battalions within the larger army that was in Asaba. And it seemed that one or two of them were very undisciplined, and one or two of them were not. And so you had some soldiers who were behaving like professionals, who knew that you don't kill civilians. General Gawan had a code of conduct for his troops, which sort of went along with basically a Geneva Convention type of approach, that you don't kill civilians. But some of the others seemed out of control. So it was almost like a bloodlust. That sounds a little dramatic, but a kind of that they were just angry. They were frustrated. A lot of the people we spoke to reported that many of them seemed drunk. They had come in and commandeered food and drink, of course. They seemed. Some said they thought they were smoking various drugs or something. Again, it's hard to verify that, but people talked about them being red-eyed and angry. They also. Asaba was a wonderful place to loot, because they did have a lot of fairly well-off families, people who had cars, who had TVs and appliances and radios and stuff, in their homes, and that seemed to be a motivation for, again, with the undisciplined soldiers who were not really under control of competent officers. So there were many reports that they would just go into houses and just loot. They would. One young man told us of how his father allowed two soldiers into his car, was trying to be friends with them, and eventually the two soldiers pulled the father out and shot him and stole the car. That was common. This was not a disciplined fighting force. It was disorganized and not well trained.
And there's a particular officer, Murtala Muhammad, who stands out in this story. How much of the blame do you put on him? And didn't he have a fairly elevated position of command?
Yeah, Murtala Muhammad was the commander of all the forces. He was colonel. He was in charge. It's not at all clear that he ordered this. In fact, it's It's very hard to know how it exactly started, what orders were given. He had a second in command called Ibrahim Taiwo, who who was a major, whose names came up in many witnesses that he was actually there at the scene when the soldiers opened fire. Mohammed was not, apparently. He was in Asaba. He had an HQ just outside of Asaba. So he was in charge, but it's not clear if he actually ordered a massacre. And I don't really think that he did. But ultimately, he was in charge of the troops and clearly was not in control. So he's generally regarded as far as the individual who probably could have stopped it or should have stopped it, or who either didn't know what was happening or knew what was happening and turned a blind eye.
You mentioned earlier, the British have this interest in the one Nigeria, and I mean, there's a real risk here of this whole state just completely falling into pieces. I mean, why don't they try to intervene at this point? Why isn't there an effort to try to rein this in, to try to act as intermediaries, to try to put an end to the conflict as early as possible?
There were efforts, probably not as early as 1967, but certainly into early 1968, there were people who tried to act as intermediaries and get the sides together. But basically, Britain wanted Nigeria to stay unified, and they were supplying arms and weaponry to the federal government. From the beginning they were, and they continued all the way through the 3 years of the war to be the biggest arms supplier. So they did try various efforts, but they were intent that they would never have any troops on the ground. They did not want to be seen as an active part of the conflict. They just essentially stood back and gave the Federals as much support as they possibly could.
And you mentioned that in general, the media failed. What you describe as the old media, that they really failed to draw attention to what was happening, to generate more of a response to condemn this kind of violence. How was it that they missed out on this?
Well, this was a time when the media were, and the newspapers and so on, were quite tightly controlled. They were tightly controlled from the Nigerian end. It was hard to get credential to go out with the soldiers, so you could actually report what was going on. There were also certainly indications that the British were trying to keep things kind of under wraps. That they didn't really want this to be known. What happened in Asaba? There were no, as far as we know, there were no press anywhere near it when it happened. So there are no photos of anything that happened. There are a few photos from a journalist with the Times of London which show the aftermath, the bombed out houses, that sort of thing. But nobody reported it. The first actual report of what happened in Asaba was in early 1968, months after the event. And when an article appeared in the Observer, a British newspaper, which talked about around 700 people killed on October 7th. That was probably an underestimate, but that's what they had there. And that it was they said it was an isolated incident. It had been sparked by an Igbo firing on the military, and it was very unfortunate. But it was seen as something that was just kind of an aberration, not as anything bigger than that. And it seemed to be quite well controlled. The story seemed quite well controlled in that sense. The government sort of spokesman was quoted and that sort of thing. So essentially, nobody knew anything about this in the West. The whole war took a long time to actually get into the Western consciousness at all. It was seen very much as, it was kind of dismissed. It was often called a tribal war, a tribal conflict. And it was kind of seen as these Africans fighting each other for reasons we really don't know. We can't figure it out. So you'd get reports, but they really weren't detailed, and it was not a huge story in the West, certainly throughout 1967. There were reports. We found reports in the Times and in other British newspapers, but there were no reports in Nigerian newspapers at all. They were all just, the federal troops advance and everything's going well. Some American correspondents were there early on. A reporter called Lloyd Garrison from the New York Times, I think he was, who were reporting. They reported on the pogroms earlier in the year, and they reported on the war. But they were never right there on the spot, as it were. It was usually after the event. So it was just ignored. Now we know that the British knew about what happened in Asaba because I did research in the archives, National Archives in London, and there were reports. So there were dispatches and things talking about the various atrocities and how essentially worried they were, particularly about Murtala Muhammad, who was seen as a very volatile and potentially out of control commander. And there were reports that say things like, well, we know what happened in Asaba. But there certainly was no attempt to make it known in the media. I think in the book, I mentioned that there's only one real account that was written at the time of what was happening in Asaba, and it was a letter that was written by then a young woman called Celestina, and she wrote a letter which she smuggled out of Asaba in the immediate aftermath of the attack to her brother, who was a Catholic priest studying at Oxford University. And he then tried to took it to various people at Oxford. He tried to get it to the media, but nobody was interested. And so there were opportunities for news to come out, but it never did. It was a time when basically media could be controlled, quite effectively.
What were the consequences of this silence, this failure to generate an international response?
Well, I think they had important consequences on the way the war went. I think, and it's hard to know, you always get into what ifs, but if the atrocity at Asaba, and not just at Asaba, but at some other small places too, where civilians had been essentially massacred in smaller numbers, if that news had got out in Britain, I think in Britain in particular, maybe elsewhere as well, but if people had known what was being done essentially with their weapons and in their name, I think there might have been more of a sense of complaint and a sense of outrage. And if that had been the case, then maybe there would have been much more pressure on the British government to do something, to intervene. But the control was pretty tight, and the government didn't want to intervene at that point, really. They just wanted it to be over, and they thought that the Federals would win pretty quickly. Most of the reports that came out around late 1967 were predicting that the war would be over by Christmas of 67 because the Federals were had overwhelming number of forces. So there was a sense of let's just wait this out and get it over with. I think if there had been real counts of hundreds of people being lined up and murdered in cold blood, I think more would have happened in Britain, possibly in the States, certainly elsewhere. I think, what is going on with this war? What is happening? But the converse of that, perhaps in a way, is that, well, while the West didn't know what was happening, the people in Biafra certainly did, because many of the people who escaped the murders in Asaba escaped over to Biafra. They took boats, they found ways over the river and found refuge with family and friends over in Biafra, young men in particular. And reports then went back to Biafra about what was going on and how the Federals are coming in and slaughtering people. This was, you can imagine, very alarming to Biafra. Their view would be, well, if they can do that to people who really are supporting them, what will they do when they get in force over here? And what it did was it really kind of steeled the resolves of the Biafrans to fight on. And that, I think, was, in a sense, disastrous, because Biafra, in a way, really was doomed. But it went on fighting for 2.5 more years after that.
And that real fear, right? That fear of a possible genocide, right, helped prolong the war.
Absolutely, there was terror that this would happen, and of course, there was evidence of certainly very brutal methods being used in Biafra itself, certainly by early '68 and so on. Air raids on hospitals and markets, and other reports of civilian killings when troops were coming into towns and so on. So there was fear that if they capitulated, they would all be killed, and so it kept the war going. And by early '68, the federal blockade on Biafra was very successful. It was cutting off food supplies. The meat producing area of Biafra had already been conquered by the Federals. Biafra's population had ballooned with all the people who came in from the north and west, and that's when the terrible starvation began. So by about the spring of 1968, that was when pictures began to come back to Britain and elsewhere, directly from Biafra, showing the starving children and the terrible conditions that were happening there. And it was about June of 1968, when public opinion started to really get fired up about what was happening in Biafra. And then things did change, but the war still went on until January of 1970.
So if we return to this community of Asaba, and you mentioned during the massacres, which really stretched out over a couple days, culminating on October 7th, that men were targeted in particular men were killed, and this, you mentioned, had a real destabilizing effect on the community and left women in a very vulnerable position. And this affected the city or the town for years, for generations afterwards. Can you go into detail about what was so traumatizing and destabilizing about how the massacres unfolded, who they affected?
Yeah, so this is a small town, and it's a very the Igbo structure is family based, extended families. So you have one man who is often, he's kind of a patriarch of the extended family. That point, many men had more than one wife, 2 or sometimes 3, but more often 2. So would each have their children. They would tend to live in compounds, and there would be the one man in charge, his wives. The wives may be living in separate homes, or they might anyway be. So he essentially is the provider for everybody. And if if something happens, say to his brother, it's a patrilineal, patriarchal kind of society. So it's men and their brothers who take care of women and children. And so when the parade started going through Asaba, they put all the senior men in the front. These were the elders, the people who are on the councils. Asaba, like other Igbo communities, has an age grade system. So when you're at a certain age, you're in a different age grade, they call it, in terms of the governance of the town. So you have an elders group in particular that essentially runs everything. And a lot of them were in the front. They were leaders, and many of them were cut down, in large numbers. So it ended up with families, extended families of women and children who often had no males left. They'd either been killed or they had fled. There's one woman we spoke with who was pregnant with her fourth child. She had 3 older ones, and her husband, who was in his 20s, his brother and his father were all killed, actually not on the 7th, but the day before. So yes, you had families which had lost several brothers, fathers, uncles, and it put a terrible strain on the family afterwards. Talked, for instance, to one man who essentially had all his brothers had been killed, and he was the only survivor, and he had to take care of his brothers' wives and children and provide for them. And it was almost impossible to do that. As I said, this was a very educated community. People expected to be able to go to school, often on to university. All of that kind of stopped. They couldn't. Well, school was closed, of course, for a couple of years, but they couldn't do those things. It wasn't particularly a farming community. There were some farmers. They probably, in a sense, did better if they weren't dead. But we talked about women who were able to kind of take over agriculture that their husbands had run and so on. But women, we talked to women who had been young at the time who had never got married because there hadn't been people to marry and they hadn't had the resources to get married. So had ended up, staying in their father's homes for all their lives. Many buildings were totally destroyed. The people lived in most of the houses were brick. Some were thatched, but a lot were not. These houses were just destroyed by shelling and so on. So you had to rebuild. You had to find a way, essentially to make a living after all this had happened. And there were families. We spoke to people who the family had basically just sort of gone into decline. The fathers or senior males had died. There was no one to take care of them. Kids didn't end up going to school that they had originally hoped to. They generations later, they're still struggling. Women had to take on roles that they'd never really taken before. Running families. Talked to several families where the mother had become. It was important. Women are very much respected in Igbo society, but they don't run families traditionally. Some of these women had to do that. They had to find ways to keep often many children through doing things like trading, trading stuff, scavenging. Some turned to actually sort of spying and smuggling across the river. Wherever they could, just to make a living.
One of the things that struck me is you said all the interviews that you did, you really never encountered or were able to interview one person who was raped, right? And that was widespread within that town. Those soldiers, after the massacres, were still in that community for an extended period of time, and women became targets.
Yes, women were targets, from right away. There was I think the fact that we never met anyone who personally said they were raped was simply a fact that it was a shameful thing that no one wanted to admit. We heard many people would tell us about other women who had been raped. That was common. We heard all the stories about how young girls in particular had to be protected and guarded, often dressed as old women, for instance, or they would be given a smaller sibling to carry on their back so it would look like they were mothers, and that was apparently that would tend to put off some of the men who might have been inclined to assault them. But yes, it's very clear that rape and other assaults were widespread, and it's not untypical, this kind of situation. There were some marriages, marriages of women who, because the soldiers were there for several months, local women did marry soldiers. There were also things that were often called forced marriages, which it's not really clear what exactly that meant, but it meant essentially a soldier would take a woman as his wife, not necessarily marry her, but move her in. And some women did accept that because it was a way to survive. They would have children. Some of these marriages ended up actually succeeding, but many did not. Many times the soldiers, when they left the women behind with children. And this was another long-term effect because there became a kind of a known population of children who were the children of rape. If they had not had anyone who was able to stand up and become their provider, the women would be left alone to raise those children, and those children were very stigmatized. They were regarded as polluted. Blood of particularly Hausa northern soldiers was believed to pollute the true Asaba people. Some of these children would be adopted by the woman's father. That was a way around getting them into the family. But of course, many of these fathers were dead anyway. So there were these sort of spiraling effects. But certainly, women in many ways bore the brunt of this. Some were killed. There were accounts of women who had either refused to be taken, refused to have sex with a soldier and were shot, or women who had simply tried to step in and stop what was happening were also shot. We didn't hear so many stories of that, but I think, to be honest, there was a certain devaluing of female casualties. The assumption is that there were many more men killed than women, and there certainly were. But there were and many important men, and so that they tend to be ones that people talk about, how many important men there were. Many women and young girls were also killed, undoubtedly.
That's a part of the skewed nature of the memory that you talk about later on. But so the war comes to an end in 1970, and you have until 2001, it's military rule in Nigeria. Is there any attention paid to what happened during the war, or what happened in Asaba? How is that past dealt with?
It isn't. I think one of the things that is very striking about Nigeria is that after the war was over, they said we were going to have reconciliation and bring everybody back into the fold and forget about the war. So there really wasn't much attempt to let people know about the war. You've got to remember, Nigeria was a very big country, and over to the west and Lagos and around there, most people probably were very much unaffected by what was happening towards the east. They didn't know unless they had family who were actually in the military, and so it was quite easy in many ways for the government to just kind of say, all right, the war's over, we're done, we're all brothers again. Now let's move on. There was a very strong impulse to move on, forget it, don't talk about it. People reported in Asaba how they tried to have kind of events, commemorations of the dead, sometimes on October 7th. They were often forbidden to do it, or they were told by the various military governments that you mustn't do this. The church in Asaba has many plaques on the pews which report the names of people who were killed on that day. Those would be people who, it's a Catholic church, who were Catholics and who had enough means to get a plaque made. But for the most part, people just told their stories within their family. It was understood what a great loss there had been. Whole generation, it seemed destroyed. But also a great fear that if they brought it up or tried to do anything about it, there would probably be consequences.
So you mentioned, well, you get to the 1990s, there's a particular book that comes out, and then there's a change of government. You have a return to a civilian government, and there's a panel that's created to investigate what happens in the past. How much of a turning point are these things in terms of addressing the memory, at least on a national scale?
Those were important. 1994, I think, was the year that Emma Okocha's book called Blood on the Niger came out. He passed away just fairly recently. His book was consisted of interviews and other things that really sort of was the first written account of what happened in Asaba. He had been a very small child when this had happened, probably just 4 or 5 years old, and his father was killed on October 7th. So he was trained as a journalist, and he made it his mission to tell the story. The book came out. I don't know how much impact it really had at the time, but it was known. And then when in 2001, with the new civilian regime, as you said, they had a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. Essentially, they became known as the Aputa Panel, which was after the chairman of the panel, and they had hearings all around the country, certainly not just about Asaba, not just about Biafra, but about various kinds of civil rights violations and other violations that had happened really in the years since independence. So people would get up and give testimony and tell about what happened, and several people from Asaba, some of whom we later interviewed, did testify at that panel, and it got quite a lot of press coverage. So that definitely was a turning point. There was a sense of people finding out things they had never known before. And it addressed not just Asaba, it addressed the pogroms up in the north, other kinds of violations that had happened under the different military governments over the last few years. But unfortunately, it sort of collapsed in the end. A report was written, and you can get it on the internet, but it was suppressed. It was never released at the time. I think the feeling was it was probably going to be too explosive. But the news was out there by then, and then you saw a rise in just people talking about it, an awareness that something had happened. But in general, the country had not known or even accepted that something like Asaba could have happened. We talked to people, for instance, who'd said when they were older, they had tried to tell people about what had happened to people in other parts of the country, and had been people had very aggressive responses. This could not have happened. Our government would never have done that to innocent civilians. So it took a long time, but from the mid 1990s through to the present, the awareness of Asaba and the other things that happened in Biafra have certainly grown tremendously.
So you get to this, the 90s, this book comes out, the panel in 2001, it's covered by the press. I think it's aired on TV, some of these testimonies as well, right? So you gain attention and awareness that wasn't there. And this happens at the same time that the internet is getting off the ground and people have new outlets to have conversations about these findings. And you had already mentioned, well, the old media really entirely missed the story at the time and failed to generate awareness that could have made all the difference. So now you have the new media that seems to pick up the story and runs with it, puts it into wide circulation. And do you find that the new media does a better job in terms of offering a just balanced account of this past?
I wouldn't say that the new media offers a balanced account for the most part. I think you just get it's like anything that happens on the internet. There's sort of plethora of voices comes out, and people start posting all over the place, but particularly on sites that are for Nigerians and often for Nigerian diaspora people. The one impact of the war in particular was how many people actually left Nigeria, and many Igbo, but many others, but certainly Igbo in large numbers ended up in the US, in Britain, Europe, all over the world really, and they have very active diaspora communities, and that's where a lot of things did happen. People would post, did you know about this story? Or this is what happened to my father. And then there'd be all sorts of discussion, often citing the Okocha book, Blood on Niger, or the Aputa panel. So a lot of just debate. Unfortunately, a lot of it was extremely ethnically divisive, because you would get people posting something had happened, and then you would get very vitriolic comments back from non-Igbo people saying, no, this never happened, you're lying, this could not have happened like this, or basically, well, they deserved it, if you're going to secede and rebel against your government, this is what happens. Losing the nuances of the fact that, in fact, Asaba never seceded from Nigeria. So a lot of chatter. I think it becomes more. It becomes more known. I mean, I think by now, I think many Nigerians and Nigerian diaspora people know about the Asaba massacre. It's become a well-known historical fact. The details of it are not always well known, or the nuances of it, but it's known. And when my colleague and I started going into, we first went to Asaba in 2009, and started interviewing people and talking to people, and it was a year after that that people in Asaba started doing regular commemorations, so commemorative events every October. Those have gone on ever since, and there's now a lot of people who are very involved in a sense of creating a memorial. They did build a small memorial near the site of the massacre that was built using local funds and fundraising and so on. The goal is to now build a much bigger park that would be more kind of symbolic of the entire of what happened, not just in Asaba but elsewhere in the Midwest. But the interest on the internet. I mean, I made a short video to about 20 minutes long, not very professional, but kind of made from pictures and interviews, and posted that really with the goal just of having something to use in presentations and so on. But it went on the internet. We posted it on Vimeo, and then it later got picked up by YouTube. Once something is out there, you lose control of it completely. And so this video was everywhere. I mean, I tried to count downloads in the first few years. We made it in 2012, and it was up to 50,000 views quite quickly. And now it's kind of available anywhere. And so you could see that what we were trying to do was create as objective an account as we could, or as simple account as we could of what happened, and try and intervene in the kind of wrangling that was going on across the internet. I built the Asaba Memorial website as well, which has clips from the interviews, transcripts, other things that sort of talk about what happened and the implications and so on. So it became almost necessary to become part of that process, in a different way than one does if writing a book or something.
But you mentioned that there's a very volatile context. So you have, on the one hand, this memory that's been kept under wraps, and now it goes viral through the new media at a time where there are lots of people who have historical grievances and resentments in reaction to their experience of military rule, and they take that memory and they use it for their own purposes. It's hard to not see this, because I just finished an episode on Gorbachev and Glasnost, and how he's surprised at this openness that he hopes to use in a constructive way ends up fueling nationalism and breaks apart the Soviet Union. It seems like a similar type of thing, that they're maybe at least certainly within Asaba, right? They hope that this memory would be used constructively, and they are hoping for reconciliation, but on a national scale, it seems to be driving the country apart.
I think that's true, but up to a point, because I think what happened in Asaba, yes, they want to raise awareness, they want reconciliation. What they often talk about is creating a sort of memorial space that would represent peace, the way they could have education about peace and about reconciliation. It's a crucial kind of difference, what happened in Asaba and what happened in Biafra generally. There's a lot of tension around the relationship between Asaba and Biafra, because most of the efforts in Asaba have been to say we were not Biafrans, we are not Biafrans, and we're not part of any kind of Biafran resurgence group. So they're trying to control the narrative about Asaba and memory, and keeping it within the context of Asaba. Biafra is another question altogether, because that is more like, I think, what you're saying about Gorbachev and Glasnost. Because the same thing that's happening around the actual Asaba massacre is also happening around the war in Biafra, which has left the Igbos to the east raw and furious for years. What happened after the war, although the government wanted to reconcile, they did not make it easy for Biafrans to come back into the fold. They basically allowed them, the details, but they allowed them £20 in the accounts that they at one time had. So they had nothing to build back again. There was a sense that the government did very little to actually build Biafra up. Biafra was in ruins. They said maybe 2 million people dead by the time 1970 came around. Starvation of a kind that almost sort of set the standard for famines. So the grievance felt in Biafra was of a many times bigger than, you might say, not bigger, but felt there were more people involved than the people in Asaba. So while Asaba was trying to distance itself from Biafra, Biafra itself had a post-war memory boom, if you like, as well, where they are telling the story of what happened in Biafra. They are, and what this does, particularly during all the military regimes, is fuel a tremendous sense of grievance. They feel that the Igbo, who were at one time the most educated, the most successful, the most westernized group in Nigeria, were essentially kept down. That's the argument anyway. And so now you're seeing several new Biafra movements, which have become quite major. They say their goal is to create a new Biafra, a Biafra reborn. And that has caused a lot of unrest, a lot of some violence, certainly some clashes with police. It's strong in the diaspora.
Is this driven by the diaspora more than from within the country?
I think there's some evidence that it is. If you talk to people who lived through the war in Biafra, most people do not want to relive that again. They have a sense that if these groups succeed, or that they could create war again. They do not want another civil war. This was an incredibly traumatizing experience, and so it's driven a lot of people in the diaspora, some people within Biafra, younger people perhaps who didn't feel the brunt of what the war did. But it's similar things that are happening. The whole Biafra thing is in parallel with the Asaba memory boom, but and Biafra often tries to co-opt the Asaba massacre as part of the Biafran resurgence. So, for instance, I saw the video that we made being posted on pro-Biafran sites, where they were using it to show what the federal government did to Biafra, while losing the point altogether that the Asaba was not part of Biafra. Or they will claim that actually they really were, because Biafra really was all of Igbo land, which extends into that part of Nigeria. So the sort of revisionist kind of approach to what Biafra was and how Asaba was connected to it.
So you mentioned the community leaders. Do you have this memory of this past of the war, Asaba? It's happening on a national level. It's happening internationally with the diaspora, the new media. But then at the same time, you have the leaders within Asaba who are trying to lay claim to their own memory. Right? They want to promote reconciliation. They want this to be something constructive, right? And you get drawn into this. They're reaching out to people beyond their community. They're reaching out to scholars. How is it that you get drawn in at this time? And then when you do start looking into how this is remembered within the community, you see it as having certain limitations that you try to counter.
Yes. We did initially. When we got drawn in, there was a series of circumstances involving a colleague of mine who was working in Nigeria in a different context. It's kind of a long story, so I won't really get into that. But what some of the leaders really wanted to do was actually bring in some scholars to really look at the story of what happened. Because this will give substance to their case, and it will be seen as somewhat impartial. That's the idea, because the part of the immediate post-Aputa panel problem was that whenever Asaba would talk about this, or leaders, there would be a sort of dismissal of what they were saying as Igbo propaganda. And so there was a sense that bringing somebody in from the outside would be helpful. So, as I said, the first visit, I thought, when I first started, I thought that I would be doing some oral histories. They wanted some oral histories done before many people died. This was in 2009. This was 40 years after the event. Many witnesses had already died, and there was a sense of the people remembering the past was beginning to dwindle. So it was a case of getting them on tape and getting their stories told. I didn't necessarily anticipate that it would become a much larger project and become a book at that point. But going back and becoming more and more embroiled in it, and then going to all the archives in London, in various resources around the US, and so on, and finding what a complicated story it really was. So yes. We became very involved in it. We also became aware that sometimes the story, the kind of simple story that was being told, was actually more complicated than people would really admit, as it were. Whenever we go to Asaba, there would be always somebody who would come up and say, "Oh, you're here to look at the massacre. That was when we all got together and we danced to celebrate, and we were cut down in cold blood. We didn't expect it. It was terrible. They gave us no warning." That story is usually told by people who weren't there. And it's became known as kind of the dance of death. There was this notion that people were celebrating joyously, and then this terrible massacre happened. And in fact, the witnesses made it clear this isn't what happened at all. That certainly people were dancing and chanting and so forth, but they were doing it to stop the violence. The violence had already started. They were terrified when they began this parade down the street. So it's a different kind of. There was certainly a betrayal, a terrible sense of betrayal, but a lot of the kind of the details are not quite what has ended up in the kind of popular imagination of the simple one-day event. We also learned that it wasn't a single one-day event. It wasn't something that began out of the blue on October 7th and ended on that day. It had been happening for a couple of days before that the people were being killed, sometimes hundreds of people at a time on the previous day. That it was a much more messy and chaotic few days than the simple sort of account of the Asaba massacre was actually telling. We learned that killings went on even afterwards. There was a second bout of killings in 1968 when the Biafrans came back and tried to invade the area around the Asaba. And soldiers went again house to house and pulled people out and killed them. And we have a lot of accounts of that. And it became known as the second operation. But several months after the first operation, if you want to call it that. So the story was complicated. And I think the thing about memory is there's an urge to rationalize it into a simple account, something that can be understood and grasped by everybody. And it's not as simple as that.
Elizabeth Bird is Professor Emerita in the Department of Anthropology at the University of South Florida. She, together with Fraser Otonelli, is co-author of The Asaba Massacre, Trauma, Memory in the Nigerian Civil War. Liz, thank you once again for sharing your time and thoughts.
Well, thank you for your interest.
For more on this subject, see the podcast website, realmsofmemory.com, where you can find a page devoted to each episode with links to additional resources. Next month, we'll hear from Salwa Ismail from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London about her book, The Rule of Violence, Subjectivity, Memory, and Government in Syria. We'll learn about how the uses of violence by the regimes of Hafez and Bashir al-Assad shaped Syrian memories and the possibilities of resistance and opposition. If you've enjoyed this episode, tell a friend and review us on your favorite podcast app. I'm your host, Rick Dadarian. Thanks again for taking time to listen to Realms of Memory.